Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the hidden debts of business and how we can minimize that impact in your business or your organization moving forward. First thing to expect is, where does this idea come from? And then we'll follow that into an intro to our business and where we have started from and where we're at today. And then the various periods of our business and the different kinds of debt during those time periods, which have similar concepts but different applications. The first time I've been introduced to technical debt was, for lack of a better word, I like to game sometimes. I like to play some video games. And so occasionally I would hear some things, and one time it clicked with me, and they were talking about technical debt. And the game in question had been released in a semi-finished state. It might be like 80% there. And or even it was relatively functional. And so from there, what the technical debt was describing was the basically the back end feel of it from a developer standpoint. And so let's say, for example, you publish a game, and in your rush to get that game out, there is some coding, there's some how you organize the files and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't really necessarily done to the standard that would best benefit you. And so when you launch it, you've now created technical debt. And so there are these issues within the game that you have to kind of go back and address. And depending on the severity and the scope of the whole project, it could be a little project or it could be a multi-month project to unwind that immediate shortcut that was taken to get done, but also means you have to go back and fix it over a longer time frame. And so I started thinking about that, and at the time I was hearing that, I was dealing with operational debt, or in another way, acquisition debt, in that I had been overseeing adding locations. This is post 2020 here, and there's all these different challenges with growing, especially during the time frame that I was in, that I just didn't know what I was getting myself into. And so I was doing everything but not really doing it well. I was just getting things going. And so after a year or two of that and hearing about technical debt, and it kind of started to click, like, oh, I have operational debt and I can't figure out why I can't get ahead. And so a lot of it's just I had to go back and fix things, which is where I'm at today, still fixing operational debt. And then like a year or so later, relatively recently, probably in 2024 here, I've heard, maybe late 2023, Alex Hormozi had talked about debt in this regard. And he talked about management debt, financial debt, skill debt, all these other things. And it really kind of clicked with me. And it really opened my eyes up to what I have been experiencing, but hadn't fully embraced that, all the different aspects of what that debt is. And so I'll link the podcast that he discusses that in the description. So this is me. And so our company, we operate subways across 3 territories in central Pennsylvania. As you can see, we have 18 locations. We're in 7 counties. And we go from one location in 1994 to our current count today in 2023. Along the way, we closed 3 locations. And so, as you can see here, we slowly grew over time, and then it just took off. And so I'll cover that based on the periods we're going through. And through the periods. So, the beginning years started in '94, where there were first location in Halifax, Pennsylvania. And then we had another location in Elizabethville, Pennsylvania. And at the time, my parents were the ones who were the franchisees. And they started with the daily operations. They were splitting their time between home and the store. And operations back then, Subway had us open until midnight as a requirement. And their previous experience had been in farming. And so there was basically a shift from taking care of dairy beef and on our farm and going into a physical location and managing that, which was a shift. But, you know, if you own a business, in many ways, you understand there are processes you have to follow. And so the one thing they did, we're glad they did, was they chose Subway after comparing a few different companies that are out there. They looked at Blimpies and Subway, and uh, I know they're thankful, and I know we're thankful that we chose Subway at that time. Now, during that time frame, those beginning years, the hidden debts were financial, operational, marketing, and tech. And the financials was Subways didn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily the busiest. Okay, we did good, but there was tough years for Subway, and financially it was understanding like how does the money work in the brand and in the business. And I know they talked about that a lot, and they had looked at getting out, um, and had thought about maybe this isn't it. Um, and so there is that debt of if you get into a new franchise and you have no experience in a certain franchise, you don't really know how that model works. Um, the franchisor might, but doesn't necessarily mean that where you put your franchise is going to operate the same exact way as it did for the franchisor. Um, so then operational debt, they're basically learning a brand new franchise. They didn't have a franchise before, but learning a whole new system and industry and everything put them at a disadvantage since they had to basically, you can't speed up experience. You have to like really live it. And so they put in a lot of time to pay off that operational debt. Marketing, when you are a farmer and you basically are a commodity and you're basically growing something as a commodity and selling it, you don't have to do a whole lot of marketing. You just buying it, selling it, buying it, selling it. And so getting into marketing, they had to spend more time in the field, in the community. And we they used my brother and I, my sister, and we were all in the business as little kids, 10 and under when we first started. And so we would do the parades, and we'd have the Subway stuff, and it was very much a small town business, and both the towns we were in at the time are small towns, still are. And so that was an experience of how does a small town business run, and they figured that one out relatively well uh, early on. And then technology, mid '90s, is going back in time and thinking about how technology was being used at the time. I distinctly remember my parents had developed the weekly paperwork, and that weekly paperwork had to be filled out by hand. Um, my dad was not going to settle for that, and so he eventually figured out how to use a typewriter to enter everything in, and then he had to fax that in, and so that was interesting. And then and since for him, he didn't want to ever settle on things, and I operate the same way. He developed what the time was called a Wiser. He basically developed the digital version of that, an Excel spreadsheet type of a Wiser, um, so that he could easily enter that stuff in. He was always pushing the boundaries with where he worked, um, on certain things. And so tech was a lot more limiting back then. You knew your numbers because you were physically writing those numbers. And so that's almost a benefit in many ways back then, was you had a lot more tangible touch on your numbers. And so a debt in this situation is more of a, compared to modern times, the fluidity and speed of technology today is so much different than the speed it was back then, and how things can get done. Moving on to the next period, we added 3 locations from 2007 to 2009, 2013. And around that time, my brother Ryan and I, we returned to business as store managers back from college. So we were growing. We wanted to invest into the business as family members. And so the debts we incurred during this time frame, while similar, were also different. And so the financial debts in this time frame were more different in that. So like the 2007 store, that was a new build inside of Walmart, which was an interesting experience. 2009 was our first purchase of a store, but that store was an hour away from our home operations. In 2013, we added another location that was a new location. And so like in the from the beginning years to this time frame, we had gone through a lot of fresh, healthy promotion with Subway and the $5 footlongs, and Subway as a brand really surged um, from early 2000s for probably about a decade. And so that financials they really improved, but the debts we really were incurring was we didn't really understand what does it mean to grow a business, um, as a corporation especially. And so getting P&Ls in our hands was not the first thought in our minds. It just, we just didn't know. Like we should have known, but we didn't know. And so we incurred a lot of debt of ignorance, just not knowing what was going on. Like we understood, like, okay, there's productivity and there's total payroll costs and there's food costs and that kind of stuff, but we didn't really understand. And that's just how it was. We hadn't yet figured out how important it was to keep learning on that side. And so, and we had an accountant, but we just weren't using it fully. At the time, my brother and I were both just store managers. And so the other debt, like operational management, kind of get tied into here together. Um, in that we started to move more towards store managers. Prior to my brother and I coming back, we were the managers. We were it. And so when you can't be everywhere all the time, you have to start relying on people. And so that management debt and not necessarily knowing how to train managers, because we were still learning how to become store managers ourselves, incurred a lot of debt that I think even to this day, we're still trying to understand what that full debt is. And so, but it just from a management standpoint, it just controls. It's understanding your controls and how you do it, and just getting consistent with that. And in this time frame here, marketing, we were still active in our communities. We would visit schools and we would do local events, and we were still relatively small at 5 locations, even if we were a little spread out for the one. And then technology-wise, we were still, the speed of technology was still holding us back in many ways. And like Subway's software for the POS was proprietary, and it required going store to store to store to update your menus and pricing and your PLUs and every other thing. And so there was a lot of friction for that. But we're still kind of figuring out what technology to use and how do we use it as we grow. And then we go into 2016, 2017. This is when my brother and I became franchisees in our parents' business. As you can see here, we added 1 location in 2016, 6 locations in 2017. We closed 1 of the locations. In 2018, the 1 location we had opened in 2013. It just had not really ever performed, even though it was a great store, clean store, made great sandwiches, great people. It just wasn't in an area, a town that just wasn't busy enough for it. So, and we closed another location that was in a mall that we had bought in 2017. We had bought that location as a pair with another location that was doing really well. So it was inevitable that it would close. It just what it is. And so here we are. We're trying to figure out how to grow a business, and we're just growing fast. And this is probably when we first started to experience some of the challenges of growth on a larger scale. And so we'll go in here to our debts here. The financial debt was real debt. There was the real debt, which wasn't really hidden stuff. It was the loans of growing. But then the financials of my brother and I becoming a layer above the business. And since we were a layer above the business, and so in this time frame, we are also experiencing marketing debt. And a lot of that had to do with, I was thrust in the role of marketing manager. My dad thought, hey, you can be a marketing manager. And he thought my brother should be the operations manager. For no other reason other than that's what he thought we should do. And he wasn't really involved in the day-to-day operations. My mom was in the financial side. Full story, he had left the business in 2017 to support the business, and was still doing that, just doing his own thing. But he helped us with growth and acquisitions and how to structure things. And so marketing and operational, those debts, we we had shifted from being in-store managers to being area but specific role managers. And it took me about a year before I said that I shouldn't be the marketing manager, just because we didn't really understand what our financials were, how our cash flow worked. A lot had to do with the debt load and productivity and cash flow. And our accountant at the time, we were getting P&Ls 6 months after the month was over. It was pretty terrible. And I don't really blame him. I just don't think he wanted to admit, or we didn't want to admit, that when we went from 5 locations to 11 in basically a year and a half, 18 months, it outgrew him. And he was a one person show, so he had an assistant, but he couldn't scale. And we didn't understand that is a thing, that we could outscale a someone. And so eventually, going into the 2020 timeframe, we changed accountants. Thankfully, it was literally across the street, and they had a whole full suite of accountants who could help us out. But that's one of those things. And so, for the debt, the operational management debt. So then we had more stores, we had more managers, and our roles really transformed into managing our managers. And that was different. We weren't getting taught that skill set from Subway necessarily. And learning how to manage managers is a whole different skill set than managing in-store, hands-on, working 40, 50, 60 hours a week in a store. You have to split your time and your focus across multiple different locations. And these locations were across multiple different counties. And so it was a lot of driving, a lot of just figuring all kinds of new things out. Technology, we started dabbling into more technology solutions for how to get things to work for us better. And then also, the administrative debt was heavy, but we didn't really understand it. We threw a lot of things for administratively onto Barb, our mom, and while she did it, it was we weren't really learning. We weren't really making the notes of saying this is how we do XYZ. And so that was something we were starting incurring that debt and not knowing it. And we didn't really understand that admin debt and how it was affecting us until the next period. And same with operational. And same for equipment. Equipment debt, this one was an interesting one based on acquisitions. And so our acquisitional debt was, I will say acquisitional debt. During acquisitions, you would buy a location, you buy a Subway, but you'd be buying the equipment for that location. And that location might have equipment that was older. You didn't really know that. Like, you would kind of know, but the way everything was tracked in the systems wasn't done well. And so we would end up incurring a lot of repair and maintenance debt, and we really didn't understand how deeply it affected us and how we paid, how it affected cash flow, for example, until the next period. And this one's the most freshest in our minds, the pandemic years. And so some other franchisees uh, had started like getting out around this time frame. And my brother and I, we were getting in. We were getting in more deeper into the business. And I had moved to the Harrisburg region, and I was ready to start adding locations that weren't an hour plus away, um, for my sake of driving around and stuff to visit locations. And so we had a location in 2020, and then 3 in 2021, another one in 2022, another 2022, and 23. Three of those locations were abandoned locations. And so the owners had been, and that was 2020, 2021, there was, of those four, three of those were abandoned, where the franchisee either took everything out of the store, left all the trash, like in 2020, um, which was an interesting experience. In other locations, they left some stuff. They left food in the store, which we couldn't touch until we took possession, which was sometimes took 2-3 months. In a location that it looks like they had swept them out the store. So those was when we really started to incur some major debt, the hidden debt, operationally, management, because now we had grown, especially those locations. We weren't buying locations that had existing management in place, and they were running really well. They were ground up reboots in what was probably one of the most challenging times in the hospitality space and pretty much everywhere in navigating this new environment. And it was tough. I would say it was a tough experience. Made it through it, but it is still leaves scars. And so I'm really going to be diving more into these debts. These are the ones that I felt the most, at least the past couple of years. All right, so financial debt. It was some of those locations we picked up, were relatively affordable. So it wasn't a whole lot of financial debt like that. Subway started going into a push during the pandemic that we need to remodel all our locations, which that is a real debt. um, some of the other hidden debt that was a slow creep until it spiked was pay rates in the marketplace. And we had predominantly operated in more of the rural, semi-suburban type environments, and Harrisburg region was more of a suburban environment, and just different cost structures in those areas. And so pay really became a hot topic. And I go back and look at what our pay was 2019 versus what it was 2022. And it was basically a 50% increase, in just a few years. And it's a shock to the system. It's a shock to our system. And it was a shock to okay. There was a figuring out how to hire people and how to recruit people. I took on some technical debt, in that I was searching for various ways to how do I recruit people. So I started using things like ZipRecruiter, um, or Indeed, or WorkStream, and basically incurring that debt of having to develop a new system of how to recruit people, because people aren't applying like they used to. And the type of people who are applying are different than what they are in other areas. And so there's a lot of learning that way. Marketing was really kind of out the window. It was, you couldn't go and do events the way you used to. And so we basically stopped marketing like 98%. There was hardly anything in those 3 years. Subway still marketed, but we just basically took those steps back to not market. Um, we would do some local stuff, but more towards the tail end of 2023, mid 2023, and that's a debt we're at to pay off this rest of this decade, really, to get it paid back and back to current. And then management debt. Since we were growing so fast, what you would normally like to be able to do is if you're a brand, you're growing your brand with new locations, and locations are doing really well. You have a good number of staff that are working at your store, and you're able to take those staff and move them to another store to give them opportunity and keep repeating that process. When you're rebooting from scratch, you don't get to have, and especially in as an area that is far away, 45 minutes to an hour from all your other locations. You don't have people who are willing to do that in your current locations. And so it was a real hard challenge. It's taken us many years to kind of build that management pool. Um, at least up until uh, the fall of 2023. But that's a whole nother story for another day. um, Admin, I started taking on all of the admin work for the Harrisburg region as I added these locations in. And that admin was all the government paperwork and I think I added more locations. Just I think my math was wrong there. I might have added 4 locations in 2023. Yeah. Anyways, and so yes, I was taking all the admin work. So I was doing all the government paperwork, health licenses, um, grease traps, and like Pennsylvania is really challenging in that every little every borough township has their own rules about everything. they, they all want a say on how everything is done, which is exhausting. um, some follow the state fire code, some do that want to do their own thing, some have different water requirements, and some have different building codes, and it is a lot to kind of keep track of. And I know I've made a lot of mistakes past couple of years here trying to keep it all together, and because a lot of it's just getting those up and running, those locations. um, Tech equipment, those two are kind of be tied together, and that we were trying to learn new ways of doing technology and the equipment. And this is really when we started to really notice, like, oh, we're buying a store and it's 10 years old. And so at 10 years old, you buy a car new at 10 years old, it's going to start wearing down a little bit more. You're going to be getting more of the um, major repairs potentially, depending on how much it's used. And so that's where we were with these subways. But the problem is we were buying these subways at the 10-year mark or the 20-year mark. And so a lot of the equipment that had been there was still there from the original time. And so we were basically purchasing locations with the math, the model that the equipment was new. We didn't really run accounting for the age the age of the equipment. Because some of that equipment, like it might have been like a $12,000 piece of equipment, but it's probably only worth $500, and we were paying for that in full, in a sense. We were evaluating based on value of what they were selling in the marketplace and NOI and all that, but we also try to evaluate that component as well as a discount, remodels and all that. So this is when we really start to see like, oh, there's these walk-in fridges, all the capsule packs are just, their compressors are going, and the equipment hadn't been maintained the past 5 years under the franchisee that was running it. And so you buy a location, think you're good to go, and then you drop $20,000 in repair and maintenance the first year. You go, ouch, because that's not, it's just repair and maintenance, and parts. It doesn't actually go back into the business to like really fix the problem. You just kind of put in expensive band-aids on stuff to try to fix another thing. And hopefully you can get to a point where you can truly fix that equipment debt, as long as all the other things, the financial debts and everything, are getting paid off. And so that's when we started to really experience more of the franchisor debt, which was us growing, stressed all of our operations, and stressed, and then so that the franchisor debt's probably the one that's the hardest to explain, in that when we got bigger, there was more expectations from our franchisor for us to be better, but there wasn't really necessarily that support to make us better. It was still kind of like, figure it out, guys, good luck. And that's where we're still at today, and working to, the reason why this channel exists is working towards fixing that problem for franchisors just in general, and business owners in general, especially who own franchisees, but any kind of business really. It's fixing the roots, fixing the foundations of your base operations, so that there's that constant state of refreshing the learning and refreshing those who exist within your organization, that they're not just along for the ride. And that's a summary of all the different kinds of debts we were facing and whatnot. And so moving on into 2024 beyond, we're looking at just kind of taking a step back and potentially having less locations, and we're okay with that, while as painful as it could be to have to take a step back and do things. I look at all these debts that we've incurred over the many years, and saying, okay, now's a chance to go back and really drill down and build out a foundation that, if I want to take it to 50 locations or 100 locations or whatever, I'm doing it in a way that I understand these are those pitfalls. These are the challenges I'm going to run up against, and just setting up a deeper, wider foundation. And that'll be covered in another video about how we can build a foundation and what it would look like and what kind of topics and references go along with that. So thank you for tagging along today and seeing the full review of what our business is and all the different debts, the hidden debts, and hopefully maybe uh, if you look at your business and evaluate it, you can see those debts today or in the future and start classifying them and putting names to them and saying, I think we have some management debt. I think we have some operational debt or administrative debt that we have to take a step back and evaluate that debt and say that and make those part of our goals and to either repair a foundation or completely start over on a foundation front. So if you liked what you saw today or heard today, uh, feel free to leave some comments. Small channel, so I will see all the comments. So feel free to like it, share it, do whatever you like with it. Love to interact. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.